Henry Ford transformed not only the automobile but working life and the role of transportation. The blue oval is one of the most recognized corporate symbols in history, continually striving to earn the trust of all stakeholders. At 9:30 in the morning on June 16, 1903, Henry Ford and other prospective stockholders in the Ford Motor Company meet in Detroit to sign the official paperwork required to create a new corporation. 12 stockholders were listed on the forms, which were signed, notarized and sent to the office of Michigan's Secretary of State. The company was officially incorporated the following day, when the Secretary of State's office received the Articles of Association. In 1919 the company was reincorporated, with Ford, his wife, Clara, and his son, Edsel, acquiring full ownership. They, their heirs, and the Ford Foundation, formed 1936, were sole stockholders until January 1956, when public sale of the common stock was first offered. The company manufactures passenger cars and trucks as well as automotive parts and accessories. Headquarters are in Dearborn, Michigan. Ford had built his first gasoline-powered vehicle, which he called the quadricycle, in a workshop behind his home in 1896, while he was working as the chief engineer for the main plant of the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. He made 2 unsuccessful attempts to start a company to manufacture automobiles before 1903. A month after the Ford Motor Company was established, the first Ford car was assembled at a plant on Mack Avenue in Detroit. In the early days of Ford, only a few cars were assembled per day, and they were built by hand by small groups of workers from parts made to order by other companies. With the introduction of the Model T in 1908, Ford succeeded in his mission to produce an affordable, efficient and reliable automobile for everyone. Within a decade, nearly half the cars in America were Model Ts. The sensational demand for the Tin Lizzie led Ford to develop mass production methods, including large production plants, the use of standardized, interchangeable parts and, in 1913, the world's first moving assembly line for cars. In 1914, to further improve productivity, Ford introduced the $5 daily wage for an 8-hour day for his workers, up from $2.34 for 9 hours, setting a standard for the industry. What happened to Ford in World War I? The First World War impacted many car manufacturers, and Ford was no different. Interestingly, in 1915 Henry Ford went on a peace mission to Europe with other pacifists to try and stop World War I. This subsequently led to Henry Ford himself becoming pretty popular. Anyway, though Henry Ford was a pacifist, he did eventually support the war effort, and the Model T became the underpinning for Allied military vehicles such as the Ford 3-ton M1918 tank and the 1916 Ambulanc. During the late 1910s and early 1920s, Ford began construction of a massive industrial complex along the banks of the River Rouge in Dearborn, Michigan. The plant combined all the components necessary for auto production, including a glass factory, steel mill and assembly line. When Ford Motor's other stockholders resisted the idea of building the River Rouge plant due to its enormous costs, Henry Ford, who as early as 1906 owned 58.5% of the company, bought them out, installing his son Edsel as president of the company in 1919. Of course, it wasn't long before the Wall Street crash hit and the Great Depression began. Like pretty much all businesses at this time, Ford had to lay off workers and scale back production. Henry Ford helped a small number of families out with loans and parcels of land to work. He angered many by suggesting that the unemployed should do more to find their own work. In response to this, the Ford Hunger March was held. On March 7, 1932, some 3,000 to 5,000 unemployed workers marched to Ford's River Rouge plant to deliver a petition demanding more support. Unfortunately, the protest turned ugly and police used tear gas and were sprayed with icy water from fire engines. It escalated even further and the police and the plant security guards ended up firing at unarmed protesters. As a result, 4 men were killed outright, a 5th died in hospital and up to 60 more were seriously injured. Ford and the Soviet Union. It was in 1929 that Ford signed a deal with the Soviet Union, in which the Soviet Union purchased $13 million worth of automobiles and parts. In return, Ford agreed to give technical assistance until 1938. Americans moved to the Soviet Union to work on the plant and its production lines, the plant later named Gorky Automotive Plant in 1932. Most of the workers left after the plant was complete, though the few that stayed ended up being victims of Stalin's Great Terror. They were either shot or exiled to Soviet gulags. The factory ended up producing the Ford Model A passenger car, called the GAZA, and a light truck, the GAZAA. Both of these were for military use immediately. What happened to Ford during World War II? Initially, Henry Ford was against the Second World War. After all, he did have a subsidiary in Germany. Interestingly, in 1936, a Ford executive visiting Germany was notified by a Nazi official that the plant manager in their Cologne factory was Jewish. He had one grandparent who was Jewish. Ford's Germany-US liaison demanded he be fired, and he was. Ford kept a close relationship with Germany before the war, to the point where he was awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle Medal from the regime. His anti-Semitism caught the attention of many, leading them to believe that sympathized with the Nazi regime. When many foreign-owned factories were taken over by the Nazi government, Ford kept 52% of his ownership, though with no control or financial gain. The Ford factories in Germany contributed hugely to the buildup of the German armed forces. Ford negotiated an agreement that meant that Germany could receive resources, particularly rubber. It was also around this time that Ford was hesitant to help with the war effort and personally vetoed plans to build aeroplane engines for the Allied forces when France fell. However, it was Pearl Harbor that led to the company contributing hugely to the war effort. The company ended up producing 390,000 tanks and trucks, 27,000 engines, 270,000 jeeps, and hundreds and thousands of parts and machine tools. After the war, the Nazi-era managers kept their jobs with Ford. They also built a new factory in Trafford Park in Manchester. The elder Ford retained full control of the company's operations, however, and returned to the presidency briefly after Edsel died in 1943, before handing it over to his grandson, Henry Ford II, in 1945. 2 years later, the legendary automaker died at his Dearborn home at the age of 83. Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947, and it was estimated that 7 million people had mourned his death. Henry II took over as chairman and CEO. In 1955, Ford introduced the Thunderbird and the Edsel line in 1958. However, the Edsel line was cancelled less than 2 years later. However, it came back with the Falcon and the Mustang by 1964. Ford of Britain also launched the first generation of Cortina in 1962. So, it wasn't all bad. In 1965, Ford US sales exceeded 2 million units. It was also in this year that Ford of Germany and Ford of Britain launched the first generation Ford Transit. In 1970, Ford introduced the Maverick and the third generation of the Cortina was launched in Europe. In 1974, Ford debuted the Mustang II, a smaller and more economical car. In 1976 was launched the Ford Fiesta by Ford of Europe. It was imported from Europe into the US market in 1978, and was launched into the economy segment. However, it was discontinued in 1981. In 1979, Ford acquired a 25% stake in Mazda, and in 1981, the third-generation Escort won European Car of the Year for the first time. The following year, the Cortina was replaced with the Sierra after 20 years. Ford increased their stake in Mazda after it was having trouble in 1996. When did Ford acquire Aston Martin? In 1987, Ford acquired Aston Martin Lagonda and Hertz Rent-A-Car, the same year Henry Ford II died. In 1989, Ford also acquired Jaguar. It was also in 1989 that the third-generation Fiesta became the fastest-selling Fiesta to date, selling 1 million units in less than 2 years. When was the Ford Mondeo launched? In 1992 was launched the first-generation Ford Mondeo. It launched in Europe in 1993 and also announced the American derivatives, the Ford Contour and the Mercury Mystique. The Ford Focus replaced the Escort in 1998 and became one of the best-selling cars in the segment and launched in the United States for the 2000 model year. In 1999, Ford acquired Volvo car division from Volvo and later sold it to Geely Automobile in 2010. It purchased Land Rover in 2000 from BMW, the same year the Escort was discontinued in Europe. To mark their 100th anniversary, the Ford GT is released along with centennial editions of some Ford vehicles. The Ford Escape was launched in 2004, and was the first petrol-electric hybrid SUV. The following year in 2005, the Mustang was redesigned to look reminiscent of the 1960s models. In 2007, Ford sold Aston Martin and announces plans to sell Jaguar and Land Rover and sold them to Tata Motors in 2008. In 2007, Ford reported losses of $12.7 billion for 2006. Ford and the present day. In 2014, the Ford Mustang celebrated 50 years of production with the launch of its sixth generation. The fourth generation Ford Mondeo was launched in 2012 at the Detroit Motor Show. This reunited Ford's midsize platform for both Europe and North America for the first time since CDW27 first generation of Mondeo since 1994. As impressive as the history might be, let's not forget about today's production. You'll find just as many models to explore and discover as you browse through the archives. It's no secret that Ford is one of the biggest and most successful automotive companies in the world. Just how big, you ask? The company produces over 5 million units each year at factories all around the world. Not to mention that they have their hand in many pies. Whether you're seeking a reliable commuter vehicle or a heavy-duty truck, there are no limits to what you can find. No matter which vehicle you choose, you'll have peace of mind knowing that it's durable, dependable, and will deliver the best possible performance for both work and fun. I hope you've enjoyed watching about the history of Ford Motor Company. Write in the comments about which brands you would like to see in the next videos. Thanks for viewing. Don't forget to subscribe to know many interesting history.